Okay, well, thanks everyone for joining. I know it's a bit late UK time. It's about 5 o'clock our time. Matthew, what time is it there?
Noon, almost exactly.
Noon. Oh, that's okay. So you hopefully you've had your lunch. So we're lucky to have Matthew Green here. I think over 15,000 citations for you for his research work, the co-creator of Cache, and also 140,000 uh, ex Twitter followers. So so we're quite privileged to have you here as part of the World Leaders in Cryptography series. So I'll start off with a simple question. What's your current role and what is a typical day? What is a typical day for you like?
Well, I'm a professor at Johns Hopkins. My typical day is all over the map. It depends on the day. But mostly what I do is I work with students, grad students, my PhD students, and we do research. We have a bunch of different projects going on at any given time. Um, I teach, not teaching right now this semester, but I teach most of the time. I teach cryptography classes here. And but I do a lot of other things. Like I try to spend as much time as I can, actually doing things that touch the real world and working on, a couple of issues that I really care about around encryption, and also trying to do. In the past, I've done a little bit of consulting, and I did a startup trying to do regulatory compliance for cryptocurrency. And really, I'm happy to talk about it, but it was a terrible, terribly hard experience. So I'm just glad it's over.
Yeah, it can be quite challenging to create a spin it, quite a stressful time.
Yeah.
So let's go back to your school days. What were you like at school? What was the things that interest you most?
So school, I'm hoping, I don't know how far back in school we're going here.
As far back as you want.
Okay. I've been programming. I had the very good fortune of my father is a professor of religion, religious studies at a college.
Wow.
And yeah, but he was always, so this college happened to be Dartmouth College, which is where the basic programming language was invented. And we were very lucky because they basically gave us a computer, like a terminal, one of the ones that make the buzzing sound and like prints on paper when I was a kid. So I've been programming since I was a very little kid, and learned a lot of different languages. And I just loved computers, and I love programming them, make computers do things. When I got older, I suddenly discovered that I wanted to do music. It's a long story. I found out later that I was not actually talented enough, but only after I got a conservatory degree in electronic music composition. And then ultimately, somehow, I got very lucky that I got a job at AT&T Labs, where they had this crazy idea that they were going to sell music over the internet. And I joined this project because I was interested in audio processing and things like that. And when I came out the other side of it, what I was really interested in was the cryptography of how do you make it so that you can sell music so that it can't be copied, and all the different things they were doing. And that's kind of how I got to where I am today. Although I don't believe in digital rights management really that much anymore. At the time, the tech was interesting.
That's interesting. So you said you got into computer science and computers at an early age. What was your first recollection of your computer system, and what was your first programming language?
Oh, okay. So I don't know that there's any one story, but I remember my first programming language was, of course, it was BASIC, and then I learned C and Pascal and other languages. PL1, which was a great language nobody ever thinks about, which literally is programming language one. Um, my very first two projects that I think are the most like I not really interesting, but like got me where I am. I remember writing a conferencing program, which is kind of the early version. It was on the Dartmouth College mainframe, like kind of the early version of Twitter. It could support 10 users, and it was all written in BASIC. It had no notion of procedures, and there was variables of one letter and one number. It was awful. But like keeping that much state in my head, I really liked that kind of challenge. So I thought that was interesting. And then, I remember a lot of just simple things where I was always really interested in the idea that like you could do things with computers that you couldn't do in the real world, like eventually like electronic cash and things, which I thought were kind of magical. And so I didn't know how to do those things, but I loved the idea that you could. And so I was always very interested in these ideas.
Great. And then when you left school, what was your route through university?
I completed a music degree, believe it or not, and a computer science degree at the same time at a small liberal arts college. And I then decided the last thing I wanted to do was school. So I left and I went to industry, and that's where I was at AT&T Labs for a few years. But I had this really lucky. I was a software developer. I was not doing any kind of research, but I was in a place that was full of these amazing researchers. I mean, I would had this. I didn't realize how lucky I was. I would look out my office window into the hallway, and I would see like people like Peter Shor, who's the inventor of Shor's algorithm, walk down the hall, and I would see Bjarne
Wow.
Stroustrup, who's the inventor of C++, walk down the hall. Never got a chance to talk to any of these people, but like I was in this place with these amazing people, and I realized that I wanted to do research, so I went back to school and got a PhD to do that.
Okay. And what was your PhD about?
I went back in as a computer science, but computer security is the focus. I kind of discovered that computer security is this vague, broad world that covers all kinds of things. But the part of it that I loved the most, the part that really wasn't just, fighting an arms race against everybody else, where we could actually maybe win occasionally, was cryptography. Because there you could build systems where nobody's going to break it next year, nobody's going to break it the year after that. It's something where we can, with really high assurance, most of the time, say that these things are secure and they'll stay secure. And I really like that. So that drew me in. But I like to do the applied side, like build systems with crypto.
Yeah. I mean, most people will be hooked by a certain topic. I find that the Diffie-Hellman method is often a great sort of topic, or RSA encryption, public key encryption, signing, and so on. What was the thing that got you hooked?
Electronic cash. I love the idea
Yes.
of electronic cash, that you could build these systems where you could have privacy and at the same time you could have this authenticity, these two things that seem to kind of go against each other, right? Like the idea that I could be invisible, but like and nobody could see what this token was, but the token itself was unforgeable and you could do all these things. I thought that was fascinating.
And there's a lot of talk about these central bank digital currencies, which you're either like really for them or against them. What challenges do you think there are in CBDCs?
So the problem with CBDCs is it means everything, right? So it means anything technologically. It means all sorts of things. It could mean, something like what we have today, where you have a bunch of, centralized databases recording stuff, and it's just the difference is that the government is creating it. It could be another word for what we already have, which is in the United States, at least, we have a Federal Reserve Bank, and it has a bunch of accounts for other banks. But what's interesting about these is yeah, I mean, CBDCs are interesting because historically we had this idea that governments created money. They created actual cash for us to use, and we've kind of abandoned that idea. We've outsourced, cash is going away, and we're using electronic payments. But the entire electronic payments infrastructure is this hodgepodge of like different banks and different credit card companies. There's no such thing as a dollar anymore. And I don't really care about the, currency, like whether a dollar is sound money part of it, but I am interested in the idea that like the ability to do payments is a fundamental service that governments should be responsible for facilitating. We used to be in the business of printing dollars to make that happen, and they had nice features. They were private, they could do all sorts of things. We got rid of that, and we've outsourced that to a bunch of companies who do it less well. And I think that bringing that, now that the technology is mature, bringing that technology back and operating as a public service seems like a good idea, but it has to be done well because it could also facilitate a lot of privacy invasive aspects as well.
And do you think that governments will be able to control their economy because there's the mighty dollar, and which
Yeah.
is all pervasive, and it really has a control over the whole world. So do you think individual countries will be able to control using this digital currency?
I'm interested. I mean, I think the idea is the attraction of it is there's a lot more control and people can do all sorts of things, some of which are good, right? So being able to change interest rates so that you can, have a negative interest rate, for example, on money, which is not something you can do with actual cash. That could be really good in an economic depression. That could be very powerful and useful. Being able to control who gets to spend money, on the other hand, that's a new feature that's possible in CBDCs, being able to track people and do all of these things. And obviously, we've seen the US government, in for good reasons and potentially for bad, has a lot of influence over how dollars are moved around the world. It's unlikely they're going to relax that control. And so, yeah, we have to see how that all pans out.
Yeah. And you've obviously worked on privacy preserving digital signatures where you can actually hide the signer, but you can still trust. Do you think there'll ever be a thing, or do you think we'll just end up with RSA and ECDSA in the future?
So they are sort of a thing. So they're used. I don't know if you're familiar with Intel SGX, but
Yeah.
Intel has this system where everything that you can basically run programs inside of your processor in a tamper-proof enclave, they call them, where the processor runs these things. You can't mess with them from the operating system. And they have this feature called attestations where you can write a signature that says, "Hey, I'm this program. Here's my hash, here's what I'm running, and here's the output I made." And for whatever reason, Intel did used a group signature scheme, a privacy preserving signature scheme for that. So I think that's possibility. I just saw today there's this thing called content something for cameras, which is basically adding digital signatures to photos taken with expensive cameras. I don't know if they use privacy preserving signatures, but the idea that you could do that makes a lot of sense. And so I think there are applications where it'll happen. The tech is still pretty new, but it could happen.
Yeah, I've certainly read the paper ZK image or something like that, where they use the private key of the camera, and I think it's used for journalists to be able to protect. But obviously, you can easily overcome these types of things.
That's
So
Yeah.
cryptocurrency is taken off, and we are where we are, and obviously Bitcoin has run for over a decade, but it's not privacy aware at all, and Ethereum too, where Zcash have got that built into them. Where do you think cryptocurrency is likely to go in the privacy space?
Oh, good question. So the way that things work today, where every single thing is public, everything you do, every transaction is public, is not long-term workable. It's just not workable at all. And it's unfortunately the way you have to do things in a volunteer-run decentralized network, because you have to have anybody capable of operating inside of this network. And so they have to see the transactions. However, we do have ways to get around this. We have all the techniques. And so the major deployment problems that we face are two problems. One of them is efficiency. It's a little more expensive to do zero knowledge in private currencies, so that's a problem. That seems to be getting handled. The more pressing challenge is, how do you deploy these systems without money laundering happening, without governments reacting to that money laundering by banning the systems? It's a tough call. We had this big example of Tornado Cash on Ethereum, and Tornado Cash got shut down by the U.S. Treasury with sanctions last year. It was one of the only privacy preserving things that was running on Ethereum. It was one of the most popular, and now it's gone. And so I'm not sure what the answer is. I mean, I have some ideas, but it's tough.
Yeah. And what's the state of the art? Is a group signature? I know that a group signature you will put on other public keys on there, and you have a way to be able to sign, and you can trust a group. And to keep it anonymized, then you can't tell the profile of the person who's signing against the other signers.
Yeah,
Do you think
some of
that's
the
the way forward?
some of the schemes use group signatures. So Monero uses group signatures where you do a collection of you pick out a bunch of other people's addresses. You take your address and you sign a message saying, "I'm one of these people." Zcash does something similar, except we do "I'm one of anybody who's ever signed anything on the chain." So they're very similar techniques where you can basically say, without revealing any information, "I'm one of this crowd," and that's the only information you leak. But you're definitely one of the crowd. By the way, should I answer questions on the chat, or should I let you pick them out, or what?
Uh,
How would you like that?
yeah, we'll just go to the chat just now. Just let me see. So, how could CBDC support an online offline transaction mode so that they can replace hard cash, some sort of cryptographic token being near field communication, tapped and then settled on a blockchain when connected to an internet connection? Oh, so it's offline payment tokenization? That's a really interesting question.
Yeah, offline payments are one of the hardest problems, right?
Yeah,
Because the big problem is double spending. So I have a offline token, and then I could copy that offline token, and now I have two offline tokens. And usually the answer in an online system, which you probably know, is you check. There's a bulletin board at least where somebody can say, did you spend that token? And if somebody tries to spend it a second time, you catch them, and that's kind of the essence of what Bitcoin and so on do. It's tough. People have been trying to do these offline currencies using trusted hardware, tamper resistant hardware, and smart cards, which is good, except the cost, this works up until the cost of breaking into that hardware exceeds the value you can extract from double spending and breaking and getting the stuff. There is some really neat work with unclonable quantum eCash, where basically you can make tokens where you can't make copies because they have basically quantum states. I'm not sure what the practicality of that is right now, but that's kind of, that those are the things that people have other than online systems.
Yeah, that's the dream of cryptographers, to have this physically unclonable function where you can have quantum activity. I don't know if you've kept up to date with the current research, but I mean that would allow us to be able to identify things much better. I don't know if you've had a chance to read some of the recent literature on it.
I'm at least a year or two out of date with the quantum cash stuff, but I know that there are schemes, but they have some limitations. They're definitely not practical yet. That is
Yeah.
a long ways from practical.
So you have a long publishing record, and what paper are you most proud of in your publishing career?
Oh, it's always the paper that nobody cares about. You know, I mean, I like all the things you mentioned. Like we did zero cash. I think I really liked working on that whole area. That was great. Another line of work we worked on, which I really am proud of because it was fun, but also important, was we worked quite a bit on uh, NSA backdoors. So the alleged backdoor in a random number generator called dually CDRPG.
Yeah.
The story behind that is crazy, where that random number generator was standardized partly by the NSA, and then found its way into Juniper devices, where it was hacked and then turned into a spying system by like apparently Chinese hackers. So that entire thing is really fascinating to me. The paper I have a paper that we just recently released, which we spent a year on. It's very hard not to fall in love with your papers, and then nobody cares. But we're working on a problem which is involves air tags, and I don't know if you know air tags, the little
Yeah.
things by Apple that
Apple.
everyone puts
Yeah.
up. Yeah,
Yeah.
these devices are privacy preserving. They change their identifiers every 15 minutes. The idea is that you don't want to carry a tracking beacon around that people can link to you. But the problem is people are now using these tags to stalk other people. So they'll put a tag in your car or in your handbag, and then they'll track, people home from a bar. And so now your phone will detect if an AirTag is stalking you and moving with you. And so we were trying to find ways so you can, the problem is that if you can detect that an AirTag is moving with you, you can also detect it in a tracking against someone, privacy preserving, privacy breaking way. So the systems that change the identifiers to protect your privacy also make it hard to detect stalking. So we're trying to rectify that and find a better solution so you get the privacy and the anti-stalking. So these are the things that I like to work on.
Yeah, and I suppose in COVID we had all this exploded, and we started
Yeah.
to look at privacy preserving. And I mean, in the UK we had a GCHQ derived method that was just basically an elliptic curve, ECIES, and it was like a plain old standard public key encryption method, and it was almost like a knee-jerk solution to it, where others were proposing homomorphic encryption and so on. So I think my question is how do we, and I'm not expecting you to answer this fully, no one has the answer, how do we create this balance between privacy, the protection of the rights of the citizen
Yeah.
to privacy, and the rights of society to protect itself from bad people?
It's tough. First of all, we have to understand a lot more about what protecting ourselves from bad people means. I think there's a lot of knee jerk view that if you just put automated surveillance everywhere, we're protecting ourselves, and I think that's not really true, right? There are a lot of ways to do protecting society without just ineffective automated surveillance. So that's the first question: is what does it mean to protect ourselves? But the other thing is, how do you build systems that can resist abuse? How do you prevent somebody from stealing the keys and then using that system designed to prevent really bad abuse for some other purpose? And the first thing we should try to do is figure out how do we technically build systems that can't be abused. And that's another area I'm really interested in, is how do we make systems that like have this capability to target specific types of abuse where abuse is really defined by the system, and you can't just claim anything at all as an opportunity to do surveillance.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. And many people are really worried about their mobile device security. What advice would you give them for that?
Right now, I would say use an iPhone. That's the best advice I have. I have friends who do exploitation. They actually work on these kind of exploits for phones. The general advice is they've all kind of come around to is that Apple security is not perfect, but it's the best. And my
Yeah.
really, really advanced friends say run a beta version of Apple Apple iOS. I'm not sure I'm going to recommend that to y'all, but that's probably the best advice I've got out there. But like in terms of other stuff, yeah, run a recent phone and don't download weird apps and be very careful with who gets to use your phone.
Yeah. And increasingly we're moving then into the hardware level for our trustworthiness because we've that's been a gap for us. We've just not seen what goes on down there, and we see things like side channel attacks and reverse engineering and monitoring code. How do you think we best create that trustworthiness within the hardware level?
I think it's a really tough area, and I think we don't know. I think we tend to think hardware is more secure than it is because nobody understands hardware. So, for example, and there was this attack that came out the other day called iLeakage. I don't know if anyone saw that.
Yeah,
It is a speculative execution attack against against Apple Silicon and against Safari. And what it basically does is if you open up, if you let's say you do a single sign-on, you open up another window. That new window opening is supposed to run in another process, but for various reasons, it runs in the same process on your phone. And then process one can spy on, well, window one can spy on what window two is doing. If that is a Google sign-in window, that means that window one, some weird website, can spy on your password and get your password out. And the reason this happens, these speculative execution attacks are terrifying, right? This is because our processors are like, we put in a piece of code that says, if security condition, then do X. Otherwise, don't do that. But our processors will go ahead and guess what the answer to that security check is, and they'll start speculatively executing one branch of the code, even if it's the wrong one. And you can see, if that touches secrets, you can pull information out of that. And that just kind of upends our whole model because when we are writing code in a paper, we say, hey, nothing after the if statement is going to happen, so we're safe. But the real world is everything after the if statement can happen, and it's not clear how to fix these things.
and I don't know if you've been watching the debate from Daniel Bernstein about the
Mm-hmm.
NIST post-quantum cryptography standards. It's really difficult to understand where it is just now. I think there was one argument that was that 2 to the power of 40 times 2 to the power of 40 for NIST ends up as 2 to the power of 80, where I think it's 2 to the power of 41. And I think there is some acquisitions again that that the NSA had some input into some of the standards. So Kyber seems to be a difficult one as opposed to NTRU. So I don't want to open up old wounds for you, but
Yeah.
where do you stand on how open NIST are with their
So
standardization process?
yeah, so I mean, just to be clear, there are a lot of people working on this. There are a lot of really good academics in Europe,
Yeah,
in the US, all over the place. This is not a NIST effort. NIST is kind of doing a little refereeing, and some people can argue about the refereeing, but they are really just kind of coordinating this process. And the people submitting, for example, the competing schemes like Kyber, they're folks who are experts. And Dan has his own schemes that he wanted to submit, and they were not. Some of them were chosen, I think. Some of them were not.
yeah,
And it's very hard for me. I think so. I mean, let me try to say this in the simplest way. Dan is a genius and he
yeah,
is one of the biggest contributors to crypto. And he's like a very, very
yeah.
smart person. But I think also there's a personal kind of what is the phrase they say about academics? And, like there is no,
Ivory
I
tower.
actually forget. Yeah, but how, like there is no
Oh,
disagreement more bitter than an academic disagreement about,
oh,
where
that's
the
right.
stakes are so low. Yeah.
Oh, yeah,
And this is
yeah,
one of these things where the stakes are actually kind of high because whoever wins this competition gets, the fame and glory. And I think that there is an element of, it's really hard to separate. Let me just say it's really hard to separate these arguments from arguments about whether a given scheme should have been chosen or eliminated in the competition. I don't think I mean, I do think the NSA is getting input on these schemes, and I think that's good because they have spent years and years studying this stuff. I haven't seen any convincing evidence that they're trying to make all cryptography broken. And I also think, dual EC aside, which was a very specific counterexample, the NSA really has no incentive to destroy the cryptography that the United States is going to use for its own top secret documents. That would be
Yeah,
incredibly foolish.
yeah. Because I think they did it before with DES, as I remember. There was
But
academics such as Marty Hellman who said that the 56-bit key was too small, and I think it was the NSA that forced it up, that pushed 3DES to happen.
yeah, they did actually reduce the key size, and but they also made a change to the S boxes, which led to it being more secure. So like
More
that's an
secure. That's
illustration
it.
of the yeah, they can
That's
go, it's a double-edged sword, right? They know things sometimes that we don't out in the public world. And the other thing about them is that they have access, everything flows into the NSA. They see everything that the academic world does, and we see nothing that they do. So there has to be some channel for them to say, hey, we know about this attack. Don't deploy a new crypto system that uses this. But without them saying, we have a secret attack
yeah,
on this particular thing. So it's hard.
yeah, yeah. And it's strange that they only came up with one standard for key exchange, public key encryption, but three for digital signatures. So they got two lattice methods, Falcon and dilithium, and then they've got the Sphinx Plus, which is Daniel's method. So he
Yeah,
he
hash
won.
based.
Should have been happy with that one. And it was very
Yeah,
strange because key exchange is right in front of us, and we probably need to change that quicker than anything else. The signatures are going to take a while. I just don't understand why they just selected one, because there does seem, and they haven't created round two for the key exchange. They've created round two for the signatures. I don't quite understand that. Obviously, isogenies failed big time. That
very
was
badly. Yeah.
unfortunate.
I can't speak to what they're thinking, but I will say, it is true that we need encryption more,
Mm.
and because the big problem with it, like signatures, really aren't going to be a problem until quantum computers actually come along, and we think that's 15, 20 years away at least.
Yeah,
Whereas encryption, anything I encrypt today could be broken by a quantum computer in 20 years. So we want to start encrypting things with lattice-based crypto or whatever sooner. And so here's the problem, right? So if you give people a menu of five choices, sometimes they get confused and overwhelmed by which of these choices should I use, and then nobody adopts a standard, and then you have Google using algorithm one, and you have Cloudflare using algorithm two, and it's a nightmare. So maybe the incentive here is for NIST to pick one good standard, try to get everyone to sort of agree on that, and then once they've got kind of an agreement, we can add another algorithm and then everybody can add that. And so, instead of ending up with a lot of people disagreeing, like in the US, we just had a big disagreement over which charging standard, which kind of charging port to use for our cars. And it was almost a disaster, but the disaster has been avoided. And so, like, maybe that's the incentive that they're thinking about.
yeah. And it seems to be the crypto wars rears its head every so often. I think you were a signature on one of the most recent uh, uh, statements, and even the EU now is talking about breaking end-to-end encryption. It's almost like we've taken 40 years to get to this point to actually properly secure the internet, and now we want to break it again. Where do you stand on this whole end-to-end encryption debate?
I am really worried about what Europe and the UK are doing. The UK just passed the online safety bill, which has this regulation in it that gives Ofcom the ability to basically make changes to things. And yeah, I'm sorry, somebody just asked a really good question, which I'll come back to on the text.
Yeah,
This is scary, but they have said they're not going to enforce it because they don't have the technology to do it yet. The EU is also pushing the CSAM bill, and I think that people here know what's going on. And the basic idea is that all messengers, private messengers, including maybe textual messaging, pictures, even phone calls are being discussed, need to be scanned for specific kinds of conversations, specific kinds of media, novel media, meaning media we've never seen before. And this has to cover encrypted messengers as well. And it's really, really scary because, first of all, we don't know how to do it. We haven't built the systems to do it very well. And, especially novel media, like how do we do that? We know that involves some kind of AI model. Where is it going to run? Where's the model going to live? So a whole bunch of stuff. So like the technical problems are not solved, but moreover, it's kind of just a decision to allow mass surveillance, very specific types of mass surveillance, but mass surveillance And once you make that decision, once you say that's the law, it's really not an easy decision to walk back. So I'm really hoping that we do not make that decision. I'm doing everything I can to try to jump up and down and convince people on Twitter. Convincing people on Twitter is easy. Convincing people who actually have the power to vote about it is hard. And it's also not my I live in the U.S. What am I going to tell a bunch of people in Europe, how to run their societies? But on the bright side, there does seem to be a lot of opposition in Europe too. So I'm happy that that's happening.
It's a difficult one
Yeah,
because you see the adverse. The adverse will say things about bad people. Do you want bad people doing bad things? And that's it becomes such a naive argument. I think Apple looked at putting the CSAM software on the device. So there's that whole debate about whether it should be on your device. And I think one of the responses to one of the questions there is about the Apple Neuro hash. So where
yeah.
do you feel about the cloud solution against an on-device solution?
So, I mean, the biggest question is, so it's a big problem with these CSA things, particularly with these CSA, the child sexual abuse stuff, is that you have these either, so there's two techniques. One uses a hash database, and neural hashes was one solution for that, where the hash takes an image and spits out a fingerprint, and the fingerprint is, compared to what the images in your text stream or your photo library. And the database, there's a centralized database run by someone, and that is basically a bunch of hashes of incredibly sensitive, horrible child sexual abuse imagery. And this has to be protected. You can't just put this plain text of these hashes on your phone because it's not, that's not enough. You have to use complicated cryptography to keep it on a server, but also make it so that, the server is not able to see your plain text images, which is what led to the Apple system. And one of the big ingredients in the Apple system, and let me try to the entire system is you start with a photo on your phone, you push it through this neural hash function, and this is a big complicated neural network model, and then you get this little digest, and that little digest then using the magic of two-party cryptography gets compared with an encrypted database that Apple has. And so the everything from the digest to the database is protected by crypto, but not neural hash. Neural hash is actually a function that runs directly on your Mac or on your phone. And that was the exposed part. That was the part of it that was vulnerable to people, actually doing reverse engineering, looking at it. And I think it took something, the proposal came out in early August of 2021. And it took something like less than 10 days for people on the internet to start coming up with collisions and showing that they could make images that, were totally benign, but that would trigger as neural hashes, that as bad hashes, or vice versa to do evasion. And these are just the kind of beginnings of the attacks that you could do on this. So the point is that the parts of the proposal that were too big to fit in the cryptography instantly got broken. And if you want to put the entire thing, let's say you want to do something like novel scanning, you want to run an actual machine learning, image recognition model that can recognize new CSA. Well, you can't put the weights for that model on people's phones, and the obvious reason, if this was a class, I would say, what's the obvious reason? Well, the obvious reason is that many of these models can be used to actually extract imagery, and you can do all sorts of terrible things. And at very least, you can evade the model by finding images that don't trigger it. So they have to keep the model secret, but the models are huge. How do you do this two-party, secret evaluation using cryptography? And we don't have a way to do that efficiently right now. So the entire idea is interesting, but hard.
Yeah. Obviously, bloom filters is one method, but that would be too big. And we have public key accumulators. There's another possibility, but again,
But
they
it's
could be
hard.
broken.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard because if you want to detect novel things like new images you've never seen before, that instantly says machine learning. And machine learning and cryptography don't get along very well. They're not best
Yeah.
friends.
And so one of the questions I think relates to what you've just said is it possible to create this balance between the EU CSA regulation and without seeing, so it's can you see within a tunnel, an encrypted tunnel? Do you think that's possible?
I mean, these are the sort of techniques, right, where you have the plain text. The client side scanning says, let's avoid the tunnel. Let's put the scanner on one side. There is this whole line of work, which is interesting. You can Google called zero knowledge middle boxes, where they basically, it's similar. You prove statements about encrypted data, and then you can have these middle boxes that don't see the data but can do filtering on it. So that's kind of a similar idea. So there are a bunch of people trying to do this. It's very hard to make it actually practically robust.
Yeah.
And so, by the way, somebody asks about GPU accelerated confidential
Yeah.
containers, which I don't know much about. And I'm interested in them, but I haven't looked at that technology, so I don't know how strong it is.
That's great. And so you talked about Peter Shaw earlier and the people that you've worked with. Uh, was there anyone you remember as a mentor, your supervisor, the people you worked with that really inspired, was significant in your research?
Well, so my advisor, I had a couple of advisors, but my main advisor was Susan Hohenberger. She was my PhD advisor, who I finished my thesis with, and so she was really fantastic. She taught me a lot of things that I know. Let's see. Yeah, I worked with a bunch of old school folks who, like designed a bunch of the underlying cryptography at AT&T that was used in a lot of their products and stuff like that, and taught me and put up with me as like a young 22-year-old who didn't know anything about crypto. By the way, one of my first projects I was given when I was 22 was somebody told me to write a random number generator based on screen refreshes on a Mac. And the idea was I would run a little thing that would like count up to a high number in a really tight loop. And then every time the screen refresh would happen, I would like check the low order bits of that. And so I did this with somebody like helping me do every step of the way. And my random numbers then went into a bunch of tests, which they all failed because it turned out that they weren't random at all. So I had a lot of people along the way who were really helpful.
That's interesting. And AT&T themselves, they really missed the internet. I mean, they had the opportunity to become a world leader, and I think they could only see the mobile phone network, as the only way. How could this little whippersnapper of routing protocols, TCP/IP, take over our massiveness? I just wonder at what time you joined AT&T. Were they still this big telecoms company, or were they
Yeah,
moving into the internet?
I joined them right at that moment. It was the moment when their business was about to crater. I got
Oh,
there. And somehow that's been my lot in life is I get to someplace right before it, collapses. So I got to AT&T in like 1999 during the height of the dot-com bubble. Everyone was super happy and they were doing great. And by the time I left in 2003, they were laying people off left and right because the entire telecom industry had collapsed and voice over IP had hollowed out their business, and like they had lost every opportunity to do anything significant because they unfortunately they didn't have the Silicon Valley ethos of spin off small companies and do stuff, and so they operated as a big, slow company and they couldn't compete at all. It was too bad.
yeah. The same thing happened with Bell Labs. They created the transistor, and then I think it was Fairchild that then took over, and then the people
Fairchild,
at Fairchild
Intel.
left there, and then they
Yep.
became Intel. Yeah, so it's really being too big that you forget to innovate now, and you're risk averse.
Yes. And but the brilliant people were still created. So in some sense,
Yeah,
like the people came out of it and did the things and they deserve the credit and it made
yeah,
society better in its way. But it just didn't get monetized by the company.
yeah. So what does the next 10 years of cryptography look like? I mean, I think we've taken 45 years to just get to the point that we've started. It's almost like RSA and public key encryption is now happening, and all the work that was done around privacy preserving crypto is now just happening now. So it's taken us a while, but we now have the toolkit, and I think everything is there. What does the next 10 years look like?
I think it's actually going to be really exciting. It's kind of scary, right? We're finally seeing this widespread deployment of all this academic protocol, multi-party computation, zero knowledge, all these things that people were talking about in the last 10 years that we're not doing. It's all happening now and it's speeding up. And so you see firms like Google doing multi-party computation, unfortunately, mostly to sell you ads in different ways and collect information, but we're seeing that happen nonetheless. We're seeing cryptocurrency really dive ahead on, FHE, fully homomorphic encryption, and a whole bunch of technologies. We're seeing deployment of things like, and somebody mentioned memory encryption. Like, I don't know about AMD memory encryption yet. I'd like to know more. But we're seeing deployment of all these new security tools. So things are happening that are really interesting. And, but on the other side of this, right, we're seeing that governments have kind of gotten wise to the idea that these technologies could really change the balance of who controls what, both currency wise and, potentially in terms of data privacy. And we're seeing a kind of complicated reaction to that. That is, I think, a little scary. And I'm worried about what the end goal of it is, what the end result is going to be.
Yeah. And when it comes to post-quantum cryptography, I mean, we've taken us nearly 5 years to define the standards, and now they're becoming FIPS. So once they become FIPS standards, then banks will adopt them. So what's the landscape for post-quantum cryptography? Because we do hear companies talking about them, and they might have billions of assets that are uh, encrypted with our traditional public key encryption. What would you see the migration pattern as looking like?
Yeah, so I mean, the good news is that a lot of companies only deal with encryption at like a high level. So they have maybe firewalls and maybe they have TLS. And increasingly, a lot of companies are outsourcing some of that stuff to companies like Tailscale or Cloudflare or whoever, content distribution network. So some of that goes away. Unfortunately, for banks, you can't get rid of that. So I do think that these schemes, one or two of these schemes will get standardized. There'll be a FIPS approved version of it, and then we're going to see the slow migration of that into all sorts of devices, and it's going to be a painful checkbox. It's going to take a long time. It's going to be done badly. But gradually, we're going to see we're better at deploying cryptography than we were in the 1990s and 2000s. So that's good. So it will be faster and less painful. Google will come first, and the tech companies will do it very quickly, and then all the slower companies will take a long time. So what's going to happen there? What I expect will happen is that there'll be some new result that shows that all of the parameters we were using for these schemes like Kyber were too small. And so this happened with RSA, where we used to use 512-bit RSA keys back in the day, and now you can break those in like a day, in less than a day. So I expect that will happen, but it's a learning experience. We'll crank up the parameters. We'll find out where we need to be, and hopefully it will work. That's the big thing. I hope we've gotten better.
Yeah, I mean, if it wasn't for Google, we would probably still be using the majority of our websites with HTTP, and it,
Yeah,
and it,
Google
and it
made a
takes
big
the
push. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
no, it's true. This was huge, and also this. I will say that the Snowden revelations of 2013 or so gave a huge kick and gave a lot of political capital to security teams who wanted to basically roll out this kind of software and encryption everywhere. Made a big difference. Really accelerated
Yeah.
things.
And
And
so
Let's
there's
Encrypt,
one.
as somebody else says.
Oh, Let's Encrypt totally changed the market, and once they
Yeah,
become a root CA, that they were flying, and I think Cloudflare and these WAFs that sit in front of the uh, of the corporate infrastructure are doing a lot, but they obviously break the encryption tunnel. And do you think TLS is generally flawed? I mean, we've moved to TLS 1.3, and all they've really done is to drop the public key getting exchanged, the key exchanged through public key methods. Do you think that it's just an archaic? Because you talked about the 512-bit RSA keys, and that was caused through the first versions of SSL, and being reduced in scope. Do you think it's still relevant?
I think that TLS has finally, knock on wood, gotten this right. I'm optimistic.
Mm.
TLS versions, SSL 3, TLS 1 through TLS 1.2 had a lot of legacy problems in them. And I feel like everyone's finally sat down in TLS 1.3 and said, how do we get rid of all this stuff and have a reasonable upgrade path? And they did get it right. And also the rate of TLS vulnerabilities, which used to be like one every year or so, has gone down to zero for the last few years. At least at TLS 1.3, I haven't seen a major vulnerability at all. So I think we finally got it right there, but then the next upgrade, we'll see what happens then.
Yeah, and I suppose OpenSSL has got a lot to answer for. It was a program that never grew up. It was 1.0 and 1.1 for a long
Yes.
time, and then it jumped to 3, and it kind of changes things. And it's finally dumped its legacy,
Yeah.
which is a bit of a shame because I quite like seeing all these old MD4 hashes and things, but it's got to grow up sometime.
Yeah, for a while they were being run. Basically, all the development was being done by one person somewhere in
That's
England.
it.
Nobody. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
Oxford.
So
Yeah,
yeah, and it's gotten a lot better since then. So there's
yeah,
been so
that's
much
good.
progress. It's boring as a cryptographer because back in the mid 2010s, it was so much fun. Like you could like throw a rock and you'd find five things that were broken, and they had like global internet scale. And nowadays everything is not as broken, and it's much less exciting.
That's great. And if there was one thing you could change in your career, what would it be? I mean, maybe you've had a perfect career and you're very happy and you wouldn't change one thing, but you talk about the spin out company didn't quite go. But what would be the one thing that you've learned that you've become a better person about?
Yeah, I think I spent a lot of time. Well, I don't know. I'm not sure I would change this. Um, okay, so I spent a lot of time. I'm a professor, right? I'm not entirely. I've done a lot of consulting and I've done written some code that's out on the internet. So I'm not totally like teaching and just watching, but I'm a professor, and a lot of what I did was criticize. Right? I had a Twitter account, and I would say this is bad. And I will say that I feel like some of that criticizing did lead to improvements in the world. In particular, I started an account writing about OpenSSL, basically making fun of OpenSSL code, which nobody cared about for like 4 years until Heartbleed happened. And then all of a sudden, everybody cared about OpenSSL. And like it turns out that I had been talking to some government folks about it, and none of that did anything except that after Heartbleed, they all looked really smart. And so I feel like some of the criticism did something good. But I would say that like being only a critic is not great. And sometimes you have to be a little more constructive. And as I've mellowed and gotten a little older, I feel like throwing bombs all the time is not always the best way to get things done, although it is really effective
Yeah.
sometimes.
Is it? I remember there was one bomb that you threw and threw it out through social media. It was picked up. So that's probably one thing that happened with you saying something about the NSA and for it to be public. Do you think you've learned how to cope with Twitter? Because you have 140,000
Uh,
followers. I mean, you must get abuse sometimes. Just random people not understanding what it is you're saying. How do you cope with that as a person?
so I have to be really honest, and I think this is like a privilege thing. It's probably being like a bearded white guy, nerdy guy on the internet. I'd probably get much less abuse than many other people. I recognize that, but it has been it actually has been really great. And actually, the sad thing is that having 140,000 followers on Twitter is a lot less relevant as Twitter kind of craters straight into the mountainside, which seems to be the current track that it's at. And so, I'm okay with that. Maybe it's a good thing for me. I'll spend less time on Twitter. I am going to say the one thing that makes me sad about that is that, especially with the CSA regulation. So one of the things that's been really nice is being able to say something about this or retweet some piece of news about this and have it get 1,000 retweets, which is one of the only ways I've been able to talk to people about this stuff is through Twitter, just kind of amplifying that. And I am sad that that sort of thing will go away. And I think that was valuable and useful, and it's too bad.
And I see that Twitter is now charging $1 in New Zealand, and the reason given is that they want to stop the bots uh, consuming so much of their bandwidth. Do you see that that's going to be the next step for Twitter X? Sorry, I should say.
Yeah, it makes no sense to me in terms of being a social network wanting to attract users. I think that's going to be a huge barrier, and I think Elon Musk is either has some deep genius plan that I don't understand, or else he doesn't know how to run a social network, and it's going to destroy the social network. And we're all going to have to learn to communicate without social networks. And again, maybe that's incredibly healthy. But I loved all the smart people I met on crypto Twitter and all the things I learned. I'm going to be sad that it goes
Yeah. And who was Satoshi Nakamoto? Do you know?
away. I wish I knew. I have no idea. I've heard every possible opinion
British.
there is.
British,
Yeah,
because he
that's a good
uses
question.
British curse
Well,
words, and it was from the Times in the days. It was the London Times. So, who do you think it was?
I think the information that I know is that his times of being awake corresponded to an East Coast U.S. time zone. So that was
Coast,
one piece
yeah.
of information people had. And then the other thing I think people don't give enough credit to is that his document, his paper, the Bitcoin white paper, is written not in LaTeX. It looks like it's written in LaTeX. It's written in Open Office, and you can see that in the metadata. And there is not a single academic computer scientist in the world who would write something in an open office if they could, instead jump off a cliff. So it's clearly not an academic. That's all I can tell you about it.
Yeah, that's good. And if you were a new researcher, say we've just taken on quite a few new PhD students, what area would you think they should be looking at? What problems should they be solving?
Um, I think so. First of all, if you're in this particular area, if you're a new researcher, I think the exciting problems, there's some really exciting things happening in multi-party computation, although there always are, and in zero knowledge and all these places. But I would not focus on how do I jump in and build the next fastest zero knowledge scheme or the next fastest NPC scheme. The place where I would jump in is I would say, look, how do I figure out how to use these systems that are incredibly fast and powerful to build new applications. And I think, like, what is the next cool new application of cryptography that I haven't thought of or nobody's thought of? That is the place that I would like, more people to be thinking about. I think that's where the real promise is. I mean, you mentioned like Intel and Fairchild Semiconductor. If you are back in that era, right, you could be the guy or the person who develops the next microprocessor that's 10% faster than the previous one, or you could be the person who founds Microsoft. And I think it's more productive now that the processors, now that all these tools are getting fast, to figure out what to do with them. We don't know what to do with them.
Yeah. And as an academic, as a teacher, where do you see ChatGPT going? Because obviously it's challenging the way that we do courseworks and tests and so on. And I think there was some work done that the ChatGPT managed to pass all the MIT exams right up to honors level. Where are we going with this? Is this a winning time or is this an amazing time of opportunity? It's a difficult question to answer, but are you frightened or are you excited?
It's complicated. I think that they will be incredibly useful and we'll find uses for them. I don't think they're going to rise like the Terminator and take over the world like some people do. I do worry because I do think that they're actually much smarter. These not smart as humans, but like I think these models actually really do have a lot more cognitive reasoning capability than we realize, and that we haven't exploited all of that. So I think it's going to definitely increase, and it does fill me with a little worry about my son who is 16 years old, and what's his job going to be in 30 years. So I have a lot of fear about that. But on the other hand, think of the amazing things we're learning about how these systems can process and all the things we haven't been able to do. So, for example, I'll just give one example: formal verification of everything, programs, cryptographic protocols. This is stuff that has been, it sounds great. Let's make everything formally verified. We've achieved perfect security, but it's human intensive. It requires months of human beings staring at things and writing proofs in very crummy tooling. If we can get AI to do that, we could have huge amounts of formal verification done very quickly. And I'd like to see that happen in the formal verification community.
That's great. And what did you learn from your startup, your spin out company? What, if you were to do it again, what would you not do?
I learned two things. One thing is that, first of all, you have a great idea, you think it's a great idea, but then like you actually try to encounter people who are trying to spend, money, and it's much harder. Suddenly your great idea is not something that people necessarily want. And when the great idea you have is let's add regulatory compliance to blockchains, it turns out that people making a lot of money on blockchains don't really want regulatory compliance. So there are some problems with that idea. And the other thing is, when you work with people, like there are people I work with well as an academic that I'm not necessarily as great with as in a business sense, and it's a whole different world. And that's just how it is. And also that it's really great to write code again. I loved writing
Yeah,
code. I really enjoyed it, but oh geez, it takes a lot of time.
yeah, I love writing code. I love the practical side of cryptography, I think, but I loved doing the practical and then relearning the principles. I learned the code first, and I've had to relearn all the maths from there. So tell us about your university. What is your university up to just now? I know it's one of the world leading institutions. What are the great things that are coming through?
AI. We are building, like everybody else, a huge AI institute, and whether we can hire enough people to actually do this or not is not relevant necessarily. But everyone is investing in AI. This is how it goes, right? You jump into the hot thing, and so I'm hoping that like we as cryptographers and security people can contribute something useful to the world of AI, so that we're able to at least around the edges make it not totally broken. And so I haven't quite found that perfect collaboration, but we're looking into it.
Yeah, there's a Venn diagram that shows AI and cryptography, and they come together nicely. And I think that's the future. The right to be forgotten is a very
Yeah.
difficult thing to actually do. The rights to privacy in machine learning, the rights to take data back, and so on. I think that's really where the kind of future of machine learning lives. And I think there'll be a lot of resistance against it.
Yep.
So in terms of your favorite topic, what's the thing that you love to teach the most in your subjects?
I let's see. So the thing that I love to teach the most is applied I teach a practical cryptography class. You know what I really enjoy teaching though? Sometimes I just like getting away from cryptography, and I taught networks recently, and it's
Ah,
really
yeah.
fun to teach people about how these, basic systems work. What I really like to do in teaching is say, look, pretend you were an engineer and you were starting with this problem. And now let's understand how you would have to solve it. And once you understand the actual setting that engineers are facing, then all of these complicated systems seem much less complicated because you understand the constraints, you understand why this came to be and why this optimization came to be. And so that's kind of the way I like to teach everything. And I feel like every part of computer science, except for theory, can be taught that way.
Yeah. And what's the next 10 years for Matthew? Where, if you were to go on a time machine in 10 years, where will you be in the world and what will you be doing? Will you still be an
Well, I hope
academic?
yeah, I will definitely still be an academic. I hope there are a handful of options for people as they get a little older in this field. You can become kind of an administrator, and I can't even answer my email, so that's not going to be me. You could go work for the government, and again, email not a good thing for me. So I like doing research, and really, I hope that I'm able to keep contributing and doing useful research. And kind of when I feel like I can't do that, maybe I'll just teach more. But I'm not going to be a happy person unless I'm able to do useful new things.
It's really good because a lot of researchers will the first thing they do is to do themselves out of teaching, which I think is a really bad thing to do. I talked to Niall Coblitz, and he's still teaching. I think it's Washington University of Washington, and he's still passionate about his subject. And it must be amazing to be taught by somebody who invented the elliptic curve cryptography. I think that would be something special. And we've had Marty Hellman, and it's just amazing, and he sits at the desk that he sat at to create the Diffie-Hellman method, and it's just so special to have that inspiration. And I think he says things like people think you're crazy having these ideas, and the kind of best way to overcome that is to prove them wrong, and he proved a lot of people wrong. Going back over the history of cryptography, what was the highlight? And when you talked about the zero cash and the people that are involved in there, but if you go back a little bit further, it's RSA and Diffie-Hellman, and then back to Feistel and all that kind of thing. Well, where's your favorite time period in crypto?
It's in the early 80s when MPC and zero knowledge were both invented. I mean, I know this seems not the most important thing, but there's these kind of amazing ideas about these fundamental, pieces of what we can do with cryptography and how they fit together with complexity classes. That I think is just incredibly important and turns out
Yeah,
to be very important for all of us.
yeah. And obviously, Audie
And
Shamir did a lot of great work around zero knowledge proofs, and obviously Shamir shares. I saw a paper today that they're talking about a lattice-based method for Shamir shares, but it's nothing like as efficient as Shamir's method.
yeah, well, we used lattice. We also used secret sharing in this AirTags paper, and we used lattice recovery to basically do
Ah,
very, very efficient recovery. So, somebody asks, "What's your advice for cybersecurity students and who love cryptography?" And yes, do a lot of reading, and I think that like a couple of really good books, like the Modern Cryptography book by John Katz and Lindell, and there's also another one by JP Amasson is really good. And Crypto Pals is a really good thing if you haven't done those. Are a bunch of crypto challenges, things like that. I wish I could give you a better, longer answer, but that's kind of my quick one that I can give.
that's great. Well, we've run out of time. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that you would like to outline to our students and to the listeners?
No, I think that I'm really enthusiastic. I'm sorry I wasn't able to answer everybody's questions on the chat because there's some good questions, but like it's
Yeah.
nice to know that there's this group of really enthusiastic people and they really care about the stuff. And I'm excited. I want to see more people who are younger and kind of enthusiastic about the stuff getting into it the same way I do. And it'll be really important that somebody takes over and also cares about these privacy issues and is willing to cross the technical policy line and do some things about them. So I'm looking forward to that.
Okay, well, thanks very much for the interview, and I'm sure you've inspired our students. So thank you very much, Matthew, and I'll keep watching all your Twitter feeds from now on. Okay, thank
Thanks
you.
for having me.
Okay, bye
All right.
bye.
Bye.